Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to today's Authors at Google Talk with Jane Mayer. Jane is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and she is the author of the new best-selling book, The Dark Side, the inside story of how the War on Terror turned into a war on American ideals. The book has been described as powerful, brilliantly researched, and was called by the New York Times the most vivid and comprehensive account we have had so far of how a government founded on checks and balances and respect for individual rights could have turned against those ideals. My name is Lisa McIntyre, and I'm from the Authors at Google team. And I have the pleasure of speaking with Jane about her extraordinary book. So, Jane, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Well, I'm really glad to be with you. I've never seen Google before except on my computer screen, so it's been fantastic to see it out here. It looks like a great place to work.
It is indeed, especially when we get to do fantastic things like this. So first, I wanted to begin by asking you about the title of the book, where it came from, and why you wanted to write this book.
Okay. Well, The Dark Side is actually a phrase from Vice President Cheney. On the first Sunday after 9/11, he went on Tim Russert's Meet the Press, and he defined what he thought America needed to do in response to the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. And what he said was actually pretty revealing, which is why I used it. He said, we're going to have to try to work, as he said, kind of on the dark side, in the shadows, without much discussion, using any means at our disposal. That's what these people do. So in that one phrase, if you look at it carefully, what he's really saying is we're going to do something in secret, in the shadows, and without discussion, without a lot of public debate, not a lot of talk, and we're going to use any means to reach our ends. The end is protecting America. And so he's kind of signaling we're going someplace we haven't been before, and you're not going to see much of it anymore. And so I wanted to find out what that meant when I wrote this book. I also thought the title was interesting in the sense that the Dark Ages to me kind of signals something. The dark side seems like the Dark Ages, and some of the things they did in the dark side were to use methods of interrogation and detention that are sort of more at home in the Dark Ages. And while we're a country that's founded on principles of the Enlightenment, they kind of went backwards in time in some ways and started, basically using a program that is some people call torture. So that got me going on it. And for an investigative reporter like myself, when somebody says we're going into the shadows and you're not going to see where we're going, it's kind of like a red flag saying, don't chase me. It makes you want to know even more.
So did it start with you just paying attention to the kind of dialogue that was coming out at the time and then digging into it then, or in a series of research articles? How did it kind of start getting teased out?
Really, to tell you the truth, when Cheney made those comments, I don't think I noticed probably any more than anybody else did, and had no idea. I didn't have the imagination to imagine where we were going with this. And it really, the first story I did for The New Yorker that got me into this was the story about extraordinary rendition, which was a program that I didn't know anything about until I got into it. But it's just an amazing program that the CIA ran. And as I was reporting on it, I just kept thinking, I cannot believe that America is doing this. It didn't seem to me like the country that I had studied about at Yale, where I was a history major, and at Oxford, where I also studied American history. And it involved the CIA officers putting on things like black ski masks so nobody could see who they were. They looked like executioners in the old days. And they had a sleek private Gulfstream jet, which was of service to them for the extraordinary renditions. They would snatch terror suspects from around the world, pick them up, slice their clothes off them with something like X-Acto knives, forcibly sedate these people, and take them against their will to dungeons, basically, around the world, where they could be questioned without lawyers, without charges, without access to any kind of judicial process, without telling their family, without allowing the Red Cross to interview them. They just basically could be disappeared around the world. And it was just such a violation of what I think of as our Constitution and our Bill of Rights that I thought it was interesting. And it got me into it, and it also got me in touch with some of the players in this program, and including some of the people who were opposed to it, who were involved, who fought it early on. Some of the people at the FBI that I talked to for that particular story were so passionate about it that it kind of woke me up to the fact that there's something going on in this country that is a really major struggle about our values. And I began to realize that it wasn't just about our security, it was sort of about our soul as a country. And in particular, there's an FBI agent in here named Dan Coleman who basically said that if you do these things, he hated the suits in Washington, as he called it, the lawyers who were saying it was okay to practically torture people, because it was people like he who were being asked to do it. And he said, I don't want to question somebody who's naked and cold and just in pain. First of all, I don't trust the information they're going to give me. Second of all, I'm not Attila the Hun. And he said, I think, if you do these things, you lose your soul. And he didn't want to be asked to do this. And he also thought it might put people like himself in jeopardy of prosecution someday. So a lot of people worried from the start. Those people's voices hit me really hard when I was talking to them, and I began to think, this is unbelievable, really an amazing story. So it unfolded.
So it unfolded through talking to these people, getting their stories. Did they start coming to you? Did you seek them out? What other
It took a lot
tools
of
of research?
And, something that might be interesting to people at Google, which is such a global company, is that it's a global story. And rendition in particular that story was very global. It took talking to people all around the world. And what I found was that there was almost a kind of a global relay race going on among reporters, where somebody would break a story in Pakistan, and there'd be a little squib about it in a Pakistani newspaper saying that, for instance, an unknown suspect had been dragged off at an airport and thrown on one of these private jets. And no one knew where the jet was going. No one knew who the people were that were taking them away. But that little piece in the Pakistani newspaper was then picked up by a reporter at the Washington Post, who then would add to it. And then there was a documentary team in Sweden that was trying to find out more about somebody who disappeared in Sweden, again, through this extraordinary rendition program. And piece by piece, the reporters around the globe were adding to it, and it would go up on places like Google, and you can actually, see what the rest of the world is writing, and you add to it. And so it was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, and I started calling the reporters in other parts of the world to see what they knew and trying to get help with their sources. And so it was really something that was pieced together in almost a kind of a community effort of reporting. So I wound up talking to people in Bosnia, people everywhere.
Going back a little bit to what you had mentioned before, is just this being kind of a turning point in American history with these new sorts of legal actions taking place. In your book, you list what you call lots on the country's history and traditions. And you mention Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. You talk about Japanese internment camps. Where do you place the events that took place after 9/11 and the War on Terror kind of in context with these other historical events?
Well, I can tell you where Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great historian, placed them, because I had lunch with him before he died, and I asked him this question because I wanted to know what would an expert say about all of this. And he basically said to me, he thought about it for a long time, and he said he didn't think there had ever been such a sustained and dramatic challenge to the rule of law in American history. And he said he thought America's embrace of what he called torture that nothing had hurt America's image in the world as much ever. So, I mean, he certainly ranked this as an incredibly serious event, and so I, again, was taking it very seriously because serious people around me were taking it seriously. where it ranks in history, we're in it still, so it's very hard to tell. This program continues right now. It has not ended. The statutes are on the books and they haven't been rejected. So I think what happens next depends on the American public. And basically, if it ends after this administration, maybe it'll take its place like the internment of the Japanese. If it continues, maybe it's going to change the character of our country, and we're just going to break faith with the founding fathers and decide that actually people don't have inalienable rights, and that some people's rights are worth violating. So I think it all depends what we do next politically. I can tell you one of my favorite quotes in the book is from a lawyer named Philip Zelikow, who was a counselor to Condoleezza Rice. So he's a member of the Bush administration, and he left and has gone on to teach history at the University of Virginia. And he told me, I think it's really important, given the fact that he's a member of the administration, that he would say these words. He said, I think in time it's going to be seen as like the Japanese internment. And he said, because he thinks that what happened in this country was a lot like what happened then, which was, as he put it, that fear and anxiety were exploited by zealots and fools. So in some ways, the dark side is the story of that fear and anxiety. It starts with the fear and anxiety of 9/11, and it charts and describes as this thing unfolds around the globe, and tries to, a lot of the challenge for me was connecting the dots between the people in Washington and the events around the world. And so that's what I tried to do in this. It's just basically one huge story.
So kind of going back to that origin of the fear and anxiety, you described this scene taking place on September 11th with Vice President Cheney in a bunker having an intense legal discussion with David Addington. And I think David Addington is maybe a name that a lot of people might not be familiar with, and I'm wondering if you can talk more about who he is, what his role has been in this larger story that you described.
Sure. I think one of the extraordinary things is there are people like this man, David Addington, who was the lawyer for Vice President Cheney. He was his legal advisor, and now he's his chief of staff. And many people probably don't have any idea who he is, and there's no reason that they would, because he doesn't give interviews. He doesn't allow himself to be photographed much. He is very much in the shadows, very secretive man, yet had such an effect on our country that I think it's extraordinary that we in a democratic country maybe don't even know the players who've been so important in this business. But he was a great believer in executive power, as was Cheney. They both felt that they were both very angry about the curbs that were put on the presidency in the Watergate period. In the post-Watergate period, there were a lot of reforms that basically had, in reaction to Nixon, they stopped domestic wiretapping without getting a warrant, and they implemented the Freedom of Information Act so that people could get information about what the government was doing, and there were all kinds of other laws that basically tried to put the brakes on a runaway executive. And Cheney had long wished to restore the powers to the imperial powers of the Nixon era. He had chafed against this, and Addington, his lawyer, really wanted to do this too. So at 9/11, they were conferring with each other right away in the Presidential Emergency Center underground under the White House, and they started talking with the Justice Department about what powers the president could have. And basically, the president's powers can be enormously expanded if there's a war. And so they declared the terrorist threat no longer would be seen as a crime. It was going to be a war. And the president was going to be the commander-in-chief. And as such, in their view, the president could really rise above most of the laws. If he was acting in the name of national defense, they argued he couldn't be constrained by mere laws. And so laws like the Convention Against Torture. They even argued that the president could order torture. At one point, John Yoo, who's a lawyer, was in the Justice Department on the phone with them that day, and he's now a professor of law at Berkeley. He was asked, are you saying that if the president ordered the testicles of a suspect to be crushed, or his child's testicles to be crushed, I think that was the question, that would be okay? The president could order that? And John Yoo said, well, It depends on what the occasion was. In other words, he wasn't ruling it out. Basically, you could do anything in their view if you were president of the United States, if you could say it was in the national defense. So it was a very extreme view of power, and yet there were no brakes put on it. And so that's the beginning of this program.
Yeah. So you mentioned someone else that I wanted to hear a little bit more about, who is John Yoo. And
well,
again,
as we just were talking about.
Yeah, so maybe could you explain just a little bit more about what his actual position is and what influence he had in kind of shaping the legal policy that came after 9/11?
Well, John Yoo was not a particularly senior lawyer. He was a deputy in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, which is not an office that many people might have heard of. It actually turns out to be incredibly important. The office is the office that tells the executive branch of the government what's legal and what's not. And so he was an expert in the presidential powers during times of war. So he had the background to jump right in. He was known as kind of a provocative academic with very right-wing views, and he jumped right in and basically grabbed the reins, along with Cheney and David Addington and just a tiny handful of other people. One of the things that's interesting to me as someone who's interested in American history is how few people really designed this program on the War on Terror and really set the course that we went on. And one of the lawyers I interviewed who was inside the White House, a fellow Republican lawyer, very conservative, who I can't name, but said to me at one point he would sit around and look at in these meetings in the White House, and he'd think, how did these lunatics ever get control of the country? And it was just such an extreme program they put in place. Anyway, John Yoo was a big part of it. He wrote up legal memos that allowed them to all but kill people in the course of interrogating people. He just defined torture, which was illegal, as in order to reach the level of torture, it had to be, you had to do something to detainees that would be equivalent to the pain they would suffer in death or organ failure. And so pretty much anything went, because very few things reached that level.
So that kind of can move us on into a specific case of interrogation. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the case of John Walker Lindh and kind of, you know, who he was, how did he fit into this narrative of the treatment of detainees after 9/11? Well,
John Walker Lindh was a local boy. He was from Marin County and kind of a lost soul who became a Muslim convert. And he was overstudying in the Arab world before 9/11, and he got more and more drawn into really radical circles in the Muslim world. And he wanted to create what he thought was the perfect Muslim state, which somehow he came to believe was what the Taliban was creating. And so he's in Afghanistan before 9/11, and he becomes literally detainee number 001. He's the guinea pig for the program, and he's picked up by the U.S. and particularly by the CIA, and it's at a time when nobody knows really how we're going to be treating terrorists. And you could see, if you remember back to how he was treated, the beginning of very harsh and unusual interrogation tactics were used on him. He was bound in duct tape, he was naked, he was put in a hood, they put a sign on his head that said shithead. He was put in a kind of a shipping crate where he was really cold and deprived of food, and a doctor's statement that I found at that time, one of the military doctors thought he was a suicide risk. I mean, it was very rough what happened to him in interrogation, and you might think that's fine, but his family had hired a lawyer in this area, and it created a great dilemma, which is, will these suspects in the war on terror be treated as criminals and be allowed to have lawyers and Miranda rights and things like that, or are we going to do something different with him? It created a gigantic fight inside the Justice Department, which you can read about in here. But the bottom line was he was eventually charged with supporting terrorism. The case fell apart because there wasn't really good evidence. He pled to more minor charges, and the mess that took place around his case convinced the Bush administration in part that we don't want to do this inside the U.S. criminal courts anymore. We're going to create a different judicial system. They took, Walker Lindh is actually serving a very long sentence in this area, think it's like 20 years or something, 22 years maybe. But just the same, they thought that the Bush White House felt that they really needed to create an alternative justice system. So, as we know, they created a system of military tribunals and of prisons that were sort of considered outside the regular law, Guantanamo and the black sites that the CIA designed.
So, you know, he was one of the first detainees. Can you talk about another one who came along a little bit later, Libi, and what was his role? What was he interrogated? What was that like?
Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, he was somebody who ran one of the terrorist training camps for al-Qaeda. He was an al-Qaeda figure. And what's really interesting about his case, he was picked up very early on. I think it was around January 2001, so just a few months after the attacks. And there was a custody fight over him between the FBI, which wanted to question him just in the ways we usually do question criminals. And they thought they were getting a lot of information out of him just by talking to him. But the CIA grabbed hold of him, and they wanted to really rough him up. They sent him to Egypt, where he was brutalized. And what's interesting as a case study in when you brutalize someone, when you're interrogating them, is that he started telling the interrogators just what they wanted to hear, whether it was true or not. And he fabricated a lot of stuff. He told them, this was right before the war in Iraq, and he told them that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and he told the interrogators also that there were connections between al-Qaeda, which he knew well, and Saddam Hussein. And there weren't. Neither of these things were true. But that information that he gave them, because he wanted them to stop hurting him, worked its way into President Bush's speeches, and into that speech, I don't know if you'll remember, that Colin Powell gave at the UN before the war, which was one of the most important speeches in convincing the world that we had to go to war, and in convincing America that we had to go to war. And that information, a year later, was recanted. But al-Libi turned around and said he made it all up. They never did find the weapons of mass destruction, and there were no links between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, as we all know, and as a Senate, studies established later. But al-Libi said, I had to tell them something, they were killing me. So he made up stuff that the Bush administration wanted to hear, and it had a very fateful consequence. It helped get us into war. Powell later described, when he learned about this, described that speech as the lowest moment in his entire career. And one of the things that's interesting about it to me also is that there were doubts about al-Libi's veracity even before Powell gave the speech, and nobody told Powell. They basically kept the doubts about al-Libi from Powell. So they let him go out on a limb in front of the UN and the whole world and give the speech at a time when there were a lot of concerns about whether what he was saying was true. Anyway, it raises the question, what kind of information do you get from torture? And it's the ultimate example, you get bad information.
Okay, well that nicely segues into my next question, which is, what is the Surre Program? What does that stand for, and what has its influence been on the interrogation of detainees?
Well, okay, this is a story that actually involves Google, believe it or not. There is a connection between Google and torture.
It's a little frightening,
it's not
but
just working
we're
late,
curious.
Yeah. Which is that I was, as a reporter, looking at the way suspects were being held in the war on terror around the world and wondering why it was that there were so many coincidences. You looked at them in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Guantanamo, and they were all being held with hoods and shackles and stressed positions and being bombarded. I remember reading in the New York Times about how they were being bombarded with weird sounds, including cat food commercials that were, playing meow meow sounds at them, and sounds of babies crying, and particularly Yoko Ono singing also, so they were being bombarded in these strange ways. They also, a lot of them had earmuffs, goggles. You've seen them, and they were being. It was a strange sort of abusive system. It looked like to me. Meanwhile, we were being told when the pictures of Abu Ghraib came out that this was just the freelance work of low-level servicemen, right? And it was just the work of a few rotten apples at the bottom of the barrel. So I was suspicious that there must be something more to this, and I wondered if there was basically a curriculum or some sort of playbook that the soldiers were working on. And so I went to the Pentagon, and I started interviewing various people, and one of the top officials said to me, yeah, you know, there's this program, and it's designed by these psychologists who work in it, and they're part of some program that's got an acronym. It's got like something to do with survival and evasion. So this is where Google comes in. I went back to my home office, and I'm sitting at my computer, and I type into Google survival and evasion, and then, you know, military program. And up pops this thing about Fort Bragg, which is where the special forces train. And it's also where the psychological command is. And there are psychologists down there that run a really strange little program called Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, the SEER program. So I found out about this from Google, basically. And I was the first person to discover there actually was a playbook, and there is a curriculum for torture, and it comes out of this strange program that the military has where they train special forces to survive torture. That's what the SEER program is. It's a program where we take people in the armed services who might possibly be taken captive, like flyers whose planes might be downed, and we subject them to a program of very controlled torture so that they might be able to survive it if they ever are taken by an unconscionable enemy. And the program that they've designed is based on communist torture methods that have been used in the past, the things used by the KGB, things used by the communist Chinese, and other sort of methods that are used to break people down both psychologically and physically. And it was actually, that SEER program has psychologists that work in it. After 9/11, when the CIA started trying to figure out how are we going to interrogate terror suspects, they had no history of interrogation themselves. CIA doesn't do that. So they turned for advice, and they turned to the SEER program, which is a defensive program meant to protect Americans against hideous torture. And we wound up actually taking those hideous torture methods and inflicting them on people. And so we wound up copying our enemies. We were copying the people that we had labeled the evil empire, basically. So it was an incredible irony. It was, you know, reverse engineered. And so the SEER program has created the template for this.
But I mean, what I've learned through your book, though, is that part of what the program was meant to do, or the origin, going back to how the KGB or others used it, it was to elicit false confessions.
Well, adding to the irony, right, so that we wound up not only using communist methods that we deplored and of countries that we had labeled torture states, but in fact those methods were used, for instance, in the Korean War, to get people to make propaganda statements. American airmen who were taken captive and put through this program of torture would give false confessions, you know, admitting all kinds of preposterous things that weren't true. So we wound up applying methods that had been used for false confessions to get the truth out of terrorists in the war on terror. It was just a mismatch from the start, not to mention an ethical and legal problem. So not surprisingly, then you get cases like Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, where he does give a false confession. It's not to say that there are no true bits of truth that have come out of the torture program. I think if torture never worked, they never would have used it. We wouldn't be having this conversation. There's some kind of, you can intuit that somehow you're going to make people talk if you do enough to them, put a gun to their head or whatever it is. You might get something out of them, and people do talk. It's just that what they say is unreliable, and it leaves the intelligence community in a dilemma of trying to figure out what's true and what's false. And so we've been led in a lot of false directions along with getting some real information. And the question now, I mean, that people in the intelligence community are looking back on all this and saying, you know, it was supposed to be a shortcut It was something that we did when we were terrorized and panicked and thought there's going to be another attack imminently. We've got to get to the truth fast. You know, it's sort of this ticking time bomb, Jack Bauer kind of situation. And if we don't get it in the next few hours, we might be blown to bits. And they thought it would get them there fast. In fact, it got them confused fast a lot of the time because they really couldn't figure out what was true and what was false. So the real question is, did we have to torture to get that truth? And people are beginning to say, actually, and one guy said to me, you know, we could have maybe given them tea and crumpets and gotten to the same place. And there have been some scientific studies. There was a big study done for the CIA, and it concluded there's no science backing up torture. There's no data backing up torture. It's kind of something we jump to thinking, you know, it's like thinking if you hit your kid, maybe it'll work. But it's just doctrinal. It's not based actually on empirical studies.
You mentioned Jack Bauer, a character in a famous TV show. Can you talk a little bit in the book how 24 is actually somewhat of an inspiration for some officials?
Well, some of the stuff in this book you could not make up. And one of them was that actually down in Guantanamo, where the soldiers were trying to interrogate terrorists or terror suspects, they were at a loss to figure out what to do to make them talk. And they were having a hard time. They were actually having a hard time. A lot of the reason was that a lot of the people they were interrogating didn't know anything. But they thought that it was because their methods were wrong. And so when they were stumped, I was told by the top lawyer down in Guantanamo, Diane Beaver, actually she talked to another colleague of mine, Philippe Sands, and she said, well, when we couldn't figure out what else to do, we were all watching 24, we would get our ideas from Jack Bauer. And so it actually was Fox's fantasy show that was creating some of the methods the United States government used on terror suspects. And I got to say, I did a piece for the New Yorker on the show 24 because I thought it as much as anything, had created the public climate that makes torture acceptable in this country, because it always works for Jack Bauer, usually within a matter of minutes. And so I went out to see the creator of the show 24, Joel Surnow is his name. He's you know, by now very wealthy, very successful TV show creator, and I can assure you, he has no understanding of the law. He's not a lawyer. He's not a military man. He doesn't know anything about Islamic fundamentalism. He knows how to get ratings, and he's great at telling stories. But they just made this up out of whole cloth, sitting in a little room someplace where they'd be thinking, okay, they would actually look around when they're trying to figure out how to do torture scenes for 24. They also were at a loss sometimes, and they'd look around the sets where they were and try to think, well, do we have anything here we could use? And they would see, like, oh, there's a sanding machine that they've been using on the scenery, and they'd say, well, let's use that. We'll just abrade the guy, you know. And so they literally were just making it up as they went along, and then this then became the instructive manual for the United States military. As I said, you cannot make this stuff up. So.
Okay. Well, switching gears a bit to someone who actually is a military person and does have a legal background, I was hoping you could tell me a bit about General Counsel Mora,
Okay.
who he was, what his views were, and how he interpreted the legal memos that came from the Bush administration.
Thanks. I mean, this is one of the things I would love to get across to people, in case you're thinking by now, I don't want to pick this book up because it's the most depressing thing I've ever heard, and this is just really dreary, is that, and it's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, when I was talking to my husband about why I wanted it to be an actual book as opposed to a series of stories I'd done, is there were fantastic people all along the way who stood up for a more humane view of what America should be and a more legal view of what America should be. And their stories really weren't getting out there. And I thought it's a piece of history that everybody should know, which is that there were great people, even inside the Bush administration, who said, we're better than that. We don't want to imitate our enemies. And in particular, there's this wonderful man named Alberto Mora, who was the top lawyer in the Navy. And he began to hear from Guantanamo tales of just insane interrogation procedures going on down there, because there were some FBI guys who were whistleblowers, and they were trying to get the word out. They thought what was happening was illegal. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They thought people were going to be arrested who had anything to do with this program. They thought there were war crimes. And so they got word up through the chain of command to the top lawyer in the Navy. And when he first looked at this, Alberto Mora, he's a Cuban immigrant to America, he first thought, he couldn't believe that American soldiers would do these things. But then when he looked into it further, he was even more shocked because he found out it was all authorized by his boss, Donald Rumsfeld. So Mora fights this great battle inside, and he's very eloquent about why he thinks it's un-American to torture. And he basically says it's not just about torture, it's about cruelty. Our government, it fundamentally transforms your relationship to the United States government if your government has the power to hurt you, to detain you, to take away all your rights. It is the opposite of freedom. And Mora, who had come from a tyrannical government in Cuba as a small child, and whose parents, one of his parents actually had been in Hungary in the Soviet days, he was so appalled that there would be, he came to America in love with the Constitution and the idea of the freedoms that were guaranteed, and he just thought it was anathema. So he fought like hell. He got some reforms. He failed on really getting rid of the torture program, but he did push it back. He left the government as something of a pariah, and a year or so later, after I wrote a piece about him and people got to know who he was awarded the JFK Foundation's award for Profiles of Courage Award for speaking up. And he's an amazing character. And there are many of them, actually, all the way through. What the country didn't get to see was, while the Bush administration was busy standing up and saying, we don't torture, and what we're doing is necessary to make you safe, so don't ask too many questions. There were people inside asking a lot of questions, and really a lot of those people, they weren't political people necessarily, they were military people who thought this is dishonorable and we do not want to be soldiers in this kind of war. There were the law enforcement people who said this is illegal. There were lawyers in the Justice Department who fought a trench war to take back the torture memo in particular, the famous memo that allowed them to do everything but torture people. And they said basically, these two of these lawyers that were Jim Comey, the #2 in the Justice Department, and Jack Goldsmith, who ran the Office of Legal Counsel, they tried so hard to get rid of that memo that they could see there was so much resistance and intimidation, particularly coming from Cheney's office, that they decided they had to talk in codes when they were discussing it. And so they had a code word for torture, and they thought they were probably being wiretapped. These are two lawyers who knew all about the surveillance program, so they had reason to be paranoid. And they felt at times that they were in physical danger, but they did it anyway, and then they left the government. And Comey gave this really, I think, moving speech on his way out, where he didn't name any names, but he basically said, for those of you who are cynical about Washington and think that nobody there really cares about anything important, you would be shocked, he said, at the way people here put their careers on the line to fight for American values and ideals, and they did. So I think that people should know that there was a really great fight going on, and there were people standing up all along the way.
Well, I think this is a really good point to open up the discussion to any of your questions, and Anne will come around with the mic.
Hi. You said that if torture didn't work, you don't think that they would have done it, and I wonder if that's really true, because it seems to me that we already knew that torture doesn't work, and this wasn't a unique historical moment when information was really desired. Like, it seems like, I don't know. So I wonder if you think that there is anything
other reasons?
Sort of like about retribution that was part of the torture.
Yes, I do actually think that there was almost like a bloodlust in the atmosphere in the White House, and I'm not just going on speculation on this. There's a description in Bob Woodward's book Bush at War where he quotes Colin Powell looking over at Bush early on, right after 9/11, and thinking in a meeting he wants to kill someone. And they were really, there was a lot of anger and a lot of sort of sense of wanting to get retribution. And I think a lot of guilt, too, because I think that they felt they'd dropped the ball on 9/11, and they wanted to show we're the tough guys in town and we're going to kick some butt. I mean, I do think that all fed into it, too. But I think that because they were amateurs, and you look at the top people in our government, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, secretary of defense, Condi Rice, the national security advisor at that point, none of them are lawyers. They didn't have experience in law enforcement. They other than Powell, they're not military people. Bush and Cheney famously were of age to have fought in Vietnam and didn't. They were not familiar with the code of military justice. It's the FBI and the military that do interrogations in this country, and they know that torture doesn't work, and they'll tell you that in a minute. But I think these people somehow thought that this was a shortcut. It was going to get them there fast. And I think, people will tell you, if you waterboard someone, which is basically partially drowning them, it's not just mock drowning, it's actual drowning that just doesn't completely drown someone. People will do anything to stop it, including talk about something. I mean, it terrifies people. But if they thought that it wasn't getting them anywhere, I'm not sure that they would have done it. I think they thought they were getting somewhere, and they discovered sort of over time that they were getting a lot of bad information. Well, one of the top guys at the CIA said to me that 90% of what we got was crap, which is pretty high level of crap, actually. So anyway, but that 10% they thought was essential.
So I saw the preface of the book. The book is for, you said it's for your parents, but I think it's more for the next generation. And I want to know, what was it that went wrong which allowed this thing to happen, and how do we stop this from happening in the future or in other places?
Well, I start the book with a chapter about panic. And I think what went wrong was people were, the point of terrorism is to terrorize a population, often to terrorize them into taking repressive action. And I think we played into that because we were terrorized. And when people get scared, they make bad choices. And the government told us that they needed to do these things to protect us. So what to do in the future, I think maybe to think more clearly in advance about how we want to handle terrorism and terrorist attacks. Because, it's likely to be an ongoing threat. It's a serious threat. I don't minimize the fact that Al-Qaeda is an evil organization that wants to cause horrible harm to us. But we have to think about how we can fight back without sacrificing our own values.
I wonder, is it mainly your point against torture and things like that, or more general, as you said, the dark side you named the book, like against anything that usually done by secret services for decades, if not for centuries, because at least secret services do things that are out of the normative behavior of law enforcement organizations. So do you think that anything that Secret Service is doing is bad, or it is just should be done by higher moral people with higher morality?
No, I mean, this country's not supposed to have secret police. We're an open democracy, and the CIA doesn't operate within this country, and they specifically set up its statute so that it would not be like the KGB or the Stasi in East Germany or something like that. No, we're not. I think that what happens when there's secrecy is there often is abuse of power and abusive treatment of prisoners, and so it's just very much not our tradition in this country. And so I'm glad the book is about how we trampled on some of our traditions. Our traditions are really actually pretty honorable. And America has a very good record on human rights and has taken the high road, particularly in its treatment of prisoners of war, starting with the American Revolution. So, and very purposefully so. George Washington talked a lot about it, about how they wanted to treat prisoners of war better than the British were treating the American prisoners of war, because we're a new country with new ideals of the Enlightenment. And also he thought it was good business. He thought, you take prisoners and treat them well, they're more likely to want to join your side. And a lot of them did, the Hessians did. So it was smart. It's self-serving and also high-minded.
I think the issue of secrecy is really important because, you know, something could happen that frightens us again, and you compared it to the Japanese internment. But that, at least, you know, for the mistake it was, happened in the open. And this, to a large degree, did not. And I think that's what we have to figure out how to prevent, is not how to not be scared, that would be good, but how to prevent these things from happening in secret. And do you see any?
Well, I mean, part of the problem was that the Bush administration declared so many things national security secrets. I mean, and I shouldn't be talking about it in the past tense. They're still with us, and they're still declaring things national security secrets. So that, I mean, for instance, one of the things that happened was that in this program, innocent people were dragged in by mistake. And so you had suspects who were renditioned, who turned out to be people, mistaken identity cases. And one of them tried to bring a case of damages, a civil suit against the United States government. And he, this is Khalid El-Masri, a German citizen who was renditioned by mistake for 5 months to a dungeon in Afghanistan by the US government. He just picked up and disappeared. And it turned out he had the same name as a terrorist, but he wasn't the one they were looking for. He tried to bring a damage suit, and the Bush administration argued successfully that he couldn't, because our courts can't have an open trial on this subject of rendition because it's a national security secret. So that it just was simply not possible to discuss this inside our country, which is interesting because there's a Hollywood movie called Rendition. So, you know, I mean, that kind of secrecy, it does seem to be excessive. And you wonder how many of those national security secrets were to protect us and how many were to keep secrets that were politically embarrassing. And Jack Goldsmith, who's a law professor at Harvard now and who was in the administration, wrote a terrific book about his experience in the administration. And he basically concluded a lot of the reasons that the administration was so secretive was they knew if they opened things up to public debate, there would be dissent and objections raised. So they preferred to work in these tiny little channels with like-minded people. You know, so I do agree that secrecy is a big problem. But.
So I'm really cynical about the reasons that we went to war, and all the stated reasons turned out to be, you know, lies, and pretty bold-faced lies, like the weapons of mass destruction and stuff like that. But I can never, like, even in a cynical way, I can't even come up with why we went into this war. Was it to give money to Halliburton? Was it because they watched Dr. Strangelove without a sense of irony and thought that was heroic? I mean, what does anybody know? Like, why? What? You know, like, I mean, Rumsfeld said, oh, it might take 6 days, 6 weeks. I won't say 6 months, and it's going to be a tax break to the whole world because the price of gas is going to go down and people are going to greet us with flowers and candy, and it's going to be a campaign of shock and awe. But what was their purpose? Like, was it really some inflated, you know, spy game?
You know, I mean, the book doesn't. There are plenty of books that have been written about the war in Iraq. This book looks at the war on terror, and to the extent that I touch on why we went in, I know that the people in the administration, Cheney's group in particular, believed that there was a link of some sort between terrorism and Saddam Hussein. I mean, and so there's a tendency to think it's all a big conspiracy and they had, you know, all these ulterior motives, and I think people had different motives, but I haven't seen any evidence that they didn't believe their own spiel about this. I think they caught themselves up in it, and
they didn't tell Colin Powell
that there were doubts. Yeah. Well, that is the closest that I was able to get to this, was that Powell was given information that there were some doubts about. I think they doubted the doubts. That's the thing. They became, it was the Defense Intelligence Agency that had doubts about this particular detainee's story, and Cheney's office just didn't believe those doubts. They thought that he was telling the truth. So, you know, I mean, they convinced themselves of a lot of things, I think, and at least that's how it looks to me at this point. And I know there's a book out by Ron Suskind that says that they forged a document after the war to try to justify going into Iraq, and you know, I just didn't come across something like that. So at this point, I have to believe that they believed their own spiel, pretty much. And there were a lot of reasons they wanted to go to war, even before 9/11. I mean, there certainly was. I mean, it is absolutely true. And you can talk to any number of people in and around the White House who will tell you they wanted to go to war long before 9/11. There was a clique that wanted to do this. And there's a scene in here where the British come in right after 9/11 on 9/12, and they basically send in top intelligence people to Washington. It's the only plane that can land in America at that point. And they go have a meeting at the CIA headquarters, and they're really worried about how America's going to react to the al-Qaeda attacks. And the Brits basically say, I hope you're not considering using this as an excuse to go to war. And George Tenet assures the British intelligence, oh no, we wouldn't do that. So, but already it was clear to the British and to lots of other people that there was a strong push to want to go to war in Iraq and to conflate these two issues. And for, you know, any number of reasons, I think.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, thanks for writing a book, because I'm interested in this kind of material, but I had heard at one time that it was after 9/11, Osama bin Laden was seen in Afghanistan, and they had backed him up, the CIA had backed him up towards Pakistan, and that the CIA had requested special forces of the army to come in and able to take care of Osama bin Laden, and that didn't happen. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that. And more importantly, what I'm really wondering is whether or not the Freedom of Information Act is going to be able to grant history in the future the ability to really understand what has happened, because people like you write a book, or other people write books, but how much is the documents that the Bush administration declares as secret documents going to hide from history what's really...
Well, on the latter, taking the latter question first, a lot's going to be up to the next administration, because they can declassify a lot of things. And the question, and a number of documents have been withheld under the argument that they are part of attorney-client privilege, so that the advice given by the Justice Department to the White House has been withheld from the American public. And when there's a new client, meaning a new president, the new client can say, well, I don't feel like this has to be protected by attorney-client privilege, so they can let it out. So there's really a tremendous opportunity for whoever is the next president to open up the books here. And as a reporter, you know, I really hope they do, because I actually think that American publics, you know, should have access to a full accounting of this. There's no reason why the public shouldn't know what the government's been doing. There are a few things that maybe need to be protected for national security. Basically, sources and methods is the line they always use it to say that, you know, to protect how we get information and sources who help us get information. But there's an awful lot that can be let out that hasn't been let out. So, and in terms of who escaped and how they escaped, you're right, there's been a lot of finger pointing and blame and a sense of that we could have done better. And obviously we still don't have Osama bin Laden. So, you know, you have to wonder about how effective all these policies have been. We do have his driver, but we don't have Osama bin Laden. You know, so I mean, there've been books about that too.
And what about the money component of that? Oh, sorry. What about how the military war machine in this country that's at $750 billion a year and hires think tanks and they have the strongest political influence in the country? How much is that shaping our international policy to go to war? Because let's face it, last year's bombs, you know, they're not as good as next year's bombs that, you know, cost $1.4 million now.
Well, you know, it's a big question, but President Eisenhower famously gave this speech about the military-industrial complex before he left the White House, and talked about the sort of built-in lobbying effort, a kind of effect that the military companies have in shaping policy. I mean, what I see now, because I live in Washington, is that after the Cold War, a lot of those companies were sort of at a loss. And there's been a new industry that's sprung up now that has really taken their place and is also becoming increasingly powerful. That's the security industry. So there's now a built-in vested interest and many jobs wrapped up in continuing to see the war on terror as a war rather than a crime, and continuing to see it as a really serious existential threat to America, because millions and millions of dollars are wrapped up in it now. And so if you were to actually come in and say, well, I think it's a threat, but it's not as big a threat as, say, our dependence on foreign oil, and I want to take those dollars and move them into, research for energy, there'd be a lot of people who'd lose their jobs. So it's become part of the political equation in Washington, for sure.
We're going to have to end here, but I want to thank Jane Mayer so much for talking with us today.
So thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for all turning out.